Tyler is going to, something I'd say Tyler has lots of different areas that he works in, philosophy of science and philosophy of biology. He's done wonderful work on questions to do with, say, the role of mechanism in biology, the process view of life. We've been people here at Egenis are interested in, works on function and evolution, for instance, but also does work in other areas like logic and philosophy of artificial intelligence. So that's what we're going to hear about today. So,
okay, great. Thanks for coming. I'm going to talk to you today about some joint work between myself and Adrian Erasmus at the University of Alabama. The title, of course, is Futility of AI Ethics, which probably explains the crowd. I think my clicker is working. Hopefully, if I click once, then I'll use my clicker after. Yes. Perhaps better subtitle, which is too long, would have been why AI is more like dogs than it is like nuclear catastrophes and biological weapons. And why, additionally, that's not a good thing. I know well, that is different. Okay. All right, so this is roughly how I'll do the talk. It takes me about 50 minutes to do this. At first, I'll give an allegory about dogs, where I'll roughly try to convince you that there's something ontological that's making it difficult for us to ethically intervene on AI, not just about policies and principles. And then in the second part of the talk, I'll explain and more something on discordance, namely that powerful technologies tend to generate this thing called discordance. And then in the last part of the talk, I'll go through 3 features that we think are unique to AI, at least by comparison with nuclear biotechnology, that make it especially difficult to regulate. So this is the rough structure of the talk. What we're trying to say is that if you have discordance and you have the unique ontology of AI, then this makes doing AI ethics somewhat futile. And by that we mean that intervention on AI that's motivated by ethical considerations is marginally effective at best and typically entirely ineffective. So importantly, we don't mean that there isn't good work going on in AI ethics. We don't mean that they're not coming up with good principles. We mean that motivation, ethically motivated intervention is just not working. By discordance, we, for now, roughly mean that there's a conflict between ethical restrictions and potential uses of the technology, and this will have 2 forms, both of which will be relevant and both of which will come back. And by the unique ontology of AI, I mean these 3 features: high resource accessibility, epistemic shallowness, and being highly proliferative that I pointed out we'll talk about in the third part of the talk. So what are those things? I'll just go through what their definitions are now so that they're in our mind going forwards, and then we'll come back to them later. So saying that AI has a high degree of resource accessibility, we mean that the materials necessary to produce powerful but unsafe or unjust models are legally and widely available, relatively low cost, and general purpose. And I should say, for the purpose of this talk, I'll often refer to things as being either unsafe or unjust, and roughly we mean those features of AI where individuals or groups tend to use them to do unsafe or unjust things that have an effect on other individuals or groups, rather than broad issues about whether AI as a phenomenon is having an effect on us.
So people online slightly starting to hear you when you move away from the computer. So it's always sort of in that corner and you're right.
Over here. Okay, great, because I need to screen anyway. Okay. So by AI being shallow, we mean that developing or using AI models often does not require in-depth understanding of the theories and methods behind the science of AI, nor practical knowledge of the purposes for which it is used. For instance, artistic and coding knowledge are not required to produce art and code. And saying that it's proliferative, I'm sorry, that's a terrible word. We have yet to come up with a better one. We mean the production of a model provides all that's necessary to produce and disseminate numerous copies of that model. So it's roughly copyability plus dissemination. The same is true of the knowledge necessary to produce models or assemble necessary hardware systems. And in fact, many AI models are freely available upon construction in public repositories of open software that can be modified for or applied to new use cases by many actors. So our central point of the talk is that these are the features that make it, together with discordance, very difficult to regulate and control AI and make it very difficult for the ethics of AI to get into traction. Right, so I should say that we think these features are, together with discordance, sufficient to explain the utility of AI, but we're not yet sure whether we think they're exhaustive of all the relevant features. There might be other relevant features, but these are the ones we're focusing on today. Okay, so plausibly these things come in degrees. For instance, proliferativity probably comes in degrees. The degree of epistemic shallowness or depth probably comes in degrees. So you might think about these things as existing in a kind of space where we could plot technologies. And essentially what we are doing is that AI sort of fits highly in this space, and nuclear and biotechnology, somewhat surprisingly, sit lower in the space, at least along these dimensions. I'll return to this as well. Okay, so this is a somewhat unscholarly talk in the following way. What I will not be doing, I'm supposed to loiter over here, sorry. What I will not be doing is bringing up a bunch of good principles and practices and ethics and trying to knock them down or arguing against them by comparing them to other better practices or something. That's not what we're doing. That's sort of been done, and there have been some critiques of that, a notable and quite good one by Luke Munn, who says the following thing in the abstract of this paper, The Uselessness of AI Ethics. The dominant response to the bad things that people do with AI has been to turn to principles. However, they're meaningless principles which are contested or incoherent, making them difficult to apply. They're isolated principles situated in industry and education system which largely ignores ethics, and they're toothless principles that lack consequences. For this reason, AI ethics is somewhat useless to do. And I want to point out right from the beginning that that is not what we're doing. Our argument is not based on the claim that AI lacks the correct set of principles or powers to intervene in specific contexts of AI use. Sometimes those are present and sometimes they're not. Our argument is instead that even if the correct or just principles and powers to intervene are present, the unique ontology of AI makes these principles unlikely to result in successful intervention overall. But for now, dogs. Let's talk about dogs for a minute. This is a pit bull wearing a muzzle, and I want to claim that there's something about this dog that makes it dangerous. That's why we have the muzzle. And this is perhaps the whole talk condensed into one slide. The pit bull is AI, and this muzzle is good policy or good principles. So you can put good policy on AI, you can have an effect on it, and you might be able to reduce some of the dangers, the unjust or unsafe uses of the technology associated with it, but a muzzle is only so good. Right? So maybe you think I'm being unfair to pit bulls here, but really the data speaks against that. If you look at any set of results about graphing a particular type of dog relative to the number of fatal dog bites associated with that dog, you see that the pit bull comes out on top on almost all of them, no matter which date range you use or no matter where you look. Of course, this is all in the United States, but it just keeps giving you roughly the same result. So I shouldn't really be picking on the pit bull. It's actually the pit bull plus maybe another top 5 or the big top 5. But clearly pit bulls and other very large dogs kill a lot of people when they bite, and they do bite a lot. So what should we do about this? I mean, people die, usually young adults and children, from dog bites is a serious cause for concern. We want to be able to intervene on it. So what do? Well, we try to make policies about it. And this is one particular policy that's quite contentious. A lot of home insurance companies in the States, according to Forbes at least, ban you from owning certain types of dogs based on breed, and 100% of them, for instance, ban you owning a pit bull in your home, also the Rottweiler Doberman, and these dogs roughly correspond to the top 5. Okay, so this is good policy if you're thinking about trying to reduce dog bites that result in fatalities. But it's good policy that you can see just by clicking back through the results, the epidemiological results, that just doesn't have the kind of effect that you would want it to have. Right. So this is probably a good time to disclaimer that I love dogs and don't think we should ban them by breed. I'm just using this as an example. Dogs are great. Okay, so the question is, why are there so many deaths from these types of dog attacks? And we should probably try to come up with an explanation for that if we want to intervene in the appropriate way. So maybe it's bite strength. I mean, it's bites that sometimes result in deaths. So let's look at bite strength. Well, if you graph it, it roughly corresponds. I mean, the pit bull sits kind of highly on there, but it's not the #1 position. So it's a rough correlation at best. If you're wondering, what's the Kangal, being that it has the highest bite strength, and why isn't it responsible for being the top cause of dog bite-related fatalities in the United States? And the answer is that it's not in the United States, it's in Turkey. That's the Kangal, a beautiful guy. Okay, so you might think, oh, well, then maybe it has to do with the proportion of the dogs. There's just more of certain dogs, and so they bite more people, and so they kill more people. But that's false. If you look at the epidemiology, Pit bull dog types are responsible for more deaths than would be expected given the relative rarity of the time. If you judiciously analyze this data, you conclude that fatalities are rare, but most dogs are fairly common large breeds of dogs. And most dogs inflicting fatal bites aren't large dogs. So it seems like largeness is relevant. Of course, small dogs do sometimes kill people, but it's usually because you hold them near your face. Okay, so it's going to be something about the biting, something about the size, perhaps. There's going to be a bunch of other features, like where your teeth are, how wide your neck is, etc. Perhaps there's something about selection. This epidemiology paper argues that there's been selection for unacceptably fierce behavior, and that's possibly part of it. But again, if you look at what the base epidemiology is telling us, it's largely having a short, wide head and being between 66 and 100 pounds that makes you more likely to bite. And again, pit bulls sit at the highest. Okay, so of course it's not just features of the dog. There's also features of the context, like lack of supervision, inadequate fencing, territorial behavior, lack of socialization, neglect and abuse are a big cause, fear-related aggression, etc. So we've identified a number of factors, and we still want to ethically intervene. What should we do? Well, it'd be nice if what we could do is we could kind of divide our features out into those features that are about policy and those features that are ontology, that they're just part of nature that we're trying to intervene on. But the problem with that kind of view, separating them out like this, is that it's a total mess and it's just not true. The problem with this kind of neat and tidy categorization of risk factors into policy and ontology, if we can make that split, is that it just isn't true nearly so neat. Clearly, elements from the top row have effects on the bottom row, and elements from the bottom row have effects on the top row. Okay, so there's going to be a kind of mess. It's not going to be clearly the case that you can just separate out those features that are relevant to policy. But nonetheless, we want to make this claim that there's a kind of gradient of difficulty in which you can use, there's a kind of gradient of difficulty starting from very easy to intervene on with good policies, such as dog breed related laws. We can directly intervene on those by changing our policies. And stemming towards things that are much harder to intervene on with good policies, such as abandonment and underfunded kennels. That's probably a little bit harder. We could fund the kennels, but we can't affect abandonment directly. There's also lack of supervision, training, etc. Abuse and neglect is going to be harder to intervene on with policy because it's done by private individuals outside of the sight of the law usually. Being of a certain breed is going to be harder to intervene on, etc. And probably having a strong bite force is going to be really on the hard end of things to intervene on. So what I'm not trying to do is set up a kind of view where there's just a strict separation between ontological factors and policy factors. Those things clearly have lots of interactions between them. But I still want to ask why things are organized like this. And I think it's quite clear that things are organized in roughly this way in terms of difficulty of intervention because of features of the nature of the thing that we're trying to intervene on. And I want to say those features are ontological. So I'm not trying to operate on the view that there's just a clean separation, but I want to say that the nature of features of the entity being regulated is what makes that spectrum. And I'll roughly refer to things on this end of the spectrum as being sort of ontological features. And if you doubt that, I challenge you to come up with an explanation for why the pit bull is the leading cause of dog bite-related fatalities in the United States, and the goldfish is not. No matter how much malice or poor training or abuse or neglect you pile into a goldfish, and even if the policies we set up were designed to make the goldfish the leading cause of animal bite-related fatalities in the United States, we would fail to do that. And we'd fail to do that because of features of the goldfish. Right, so you're probably thinking, you've got the wrong level of analysis. And I don't think we have the wrong level of analysis. It's just that lots of levels of analysis are relevant. So of course, it's not just the nature of the dog that has an influence on the difficulty for good policies to affect injuries. It's also the nature of the system in which dogs are produced. And we think that's true. Dogs are often produced in puppy mills that involve a lot of abuse and neglect and sort of engendering fear aggression. But importantly, that's not the same thing as saying it's just the policies or principles applicable to the system in which dogs are produced, which makes it difficult for good policies to affect injuries. It's other features of that system as well. Right, so I'm going to be a bit flippant about this just because this is just an allegory about dogs, and I'll identify 3 features that I think are relevant. 1, dogs are easy to get, usually legal in most places and relatively inexpensive to keep alive. It's also easy to train a dog to be aggressive and perhaps more difficult to train them not to be. If you intend to breed and own an aggressive and physically capable dog, you can do that without much education or training. And finally, dogs can be used to quickly make other dogs. If you get two of the right dogs, you can make more of that type of dog at home, and you can sell them to people. Right, so these create extremely relevant features for why there's a problem with lethal dog bites in the United States, and these, of course, correspond to resource accessibility, epistemic shallowness, and proliferativity. Right, so that's my allegory about dogs. I hope to have convinced you that we can identify certain relevant features of the ontology of some situation, that nature of that situation, that tracks both the nature of that entity and why it's difficult to regulate and control that thing. Now I want to talk about discordance, and specifically I want to argue in this structure for a claim about discordance. I want to argue that any sufficiently powerful technology for which safety or justice constraints tends to limit its powers generates discordance. That is, a conflict between those who intend to use the technology safely or justly, and those who intend to use it to maximize on the purposes that it might serve. And our argument for this is going to be historical. We're just going to point to a lot of cases and say this has happened quite a lot. And for plenty of you to point to other similar cases. So this is just a warning. That says I'm going to read some argumentative text. I read a lot of the text that's on the screen. You don't need to read it all. It's just there in case you like to read it all. Right, so I said discordance has two types. Let's just talk about the first type first. This is internal conflict of interest that exists, internal conflict within groups that have reason to use, but also have reason to constrain technologies. And I'll give a kind of staple example from AI. So for a type 1 example, take any group of artists, including both artists using traditional mediums and others using AI, at least in part in their method. Because the use of AI methods in art has the potential to produce art at a faster pace, for example, with less time spent in training or drafting, those artists using traditional mediums have some reason to aim for constraint of AI use in their community, and those using AI methods have some reason to aim for the unconstrained use of AI in their community. Since the pace of production of art is in part an issue of livelihood, this is also plausibly an issue of justice within that community. This is another type 1 example that I think is perhaps a bit more grave and serious, specifically the use of killer robots or lethal autonomous robots, or LARs, within the military. So LARs generate discordance with within groups that intend to use them, militaries or governments, since they're technologies with many different powers. LARs have different but entangled powers, some of which motivate ethical interventions to limit their power, and others motivate contrarily. For example, LARs being autonomous means that they risk failing to discriminate between combatants and non-combatants, which is a serious cause for ethical intervention, quite obviously. Nonetheless, autonomy in LARs also provides for speed. Speed, in turn, might make a difference in reducing friendly casualties, which is also a serious ethical motivation. So even assuming that a military using LARs has the best intention to introduce ethical constraints, which is a serious assumption, powerful and multi-purpose technologies like LARs are still liable to generate discordance within that military by creating conflicts among distinct ethical aims. Let's go for a type 2 example. And so this is probably the classic type 2 example of discordance. If you take Isaac Asimov's I, Robot, where famously were introduced these laws of robotics, the first one, which will be relevant, a robot may not injure a human being or through an action allow a human being to come to harm, and ignore for a minute the story wherein these things somehow combine to produce an AI that has some authoritarian desire to control us all. Werner Vinge pointed out the following fact, that these are sort of performance rules, and performance rules strict enough to be safe would also produce a device whose ability was clearly inferior to the unfettered versions, and so human competition would favor the development of those more dangerous models. So if you want to build an AI to, say, play the stock market for you, and it operates on Asimov's laws of robotics such that it might not injure a human being, and it learns that by bumping up the value of Apple stock, it results in an increase in nickel mining, and nickel mining results in a lot of people's deaths, then it's not going to be allowed to do that. And so that model, that one that's 3 laws secure or performance safe, would be inferior to the model that isn't 3 laws secure. Right, so that generates a kind of group of people that want to use the unsafe or more dangerous model. Let's leave AI behind for a minute. I said our justification for this point was going to be historical. So let's go with the printing press. Speaking to the US Congress about regulations of AI, OpenAI CEO Sam Altman claimed that the recent development of AI could be, if we made it so, a printing press moment. And a discussion ensued about whether a better analogy would be the atomic bomb. We'll see that it isn't a better analogy. But for our purposes, it's sufficient to note any analogy with other technological developments that have had significant, widespread, and highly valued impacts, and the printing press will do just fine for this. So why would he say that? Clearly, he intended the analogy with the printing press to suggest an overwhelmingly positive case of technological development. But the printing press also had negative consequences. I'll read some. The dissemination of false and misleading information, the rapid spread of ideas leading to conflicts, the increased dissemination of perhaps true, heretical information that could be misused to a larger group of individuals outside the priesthood, the disenfranchisement of scribes, the reduction in quality of disseminated materials, and I think we could come up with others. All of these, I want to say, either are or were plausibly either justice and or safety. And so, for analogy, with AI ethics, if anyone had claimed that a program of printing press ethics could reasonably be expected to curtail the worst consequences of development of the printing press, for instance, by censorship of printed materials or restriction of use of printing presses to groups with only just or safe interests, etc., they would clearly have been quite wrong to claim that. Those consequences obtained, that is, those worst consequences. Insofar as, for example, censors ever succeeded in censoring false, misleading, unjust, or unsafe material from being printed on some press, that material was often simply printed elsewhere, generating a type 2 discordance. That is, a conflict between different parties. Okay, so I take us to have defended this claim with a limited number of examples. We could probably provide more. That sufficiently powerful technologies generate discordance. Combined with the claim that AI is a sufficiently powerful technology, this leads to the quite obvious conclusion that AI tends to generate discordance. And perhaps this is sort of pretty obvious stuff, but I felt like it merited at least some argument since it's a fundamental part of the claim we're making. Discordance presents a difficulty for the ethical management of technologies, but it's far from sufficient to prevent successful ethically motivated intervention. Many technologies that generate high levels of discordance between parties are effectively controlled. For example, despite the potential benefits of many unethical applications of nuclear technology, there have been relatively few instances of such applications. Similarly, biotechnology clearly generates a high degree of discordance between interested parties, yet actual harms are seldom realized. Ethical intervention on AI, however, has not been as effective. And the reason for this is that AI differs, we want to say, in unique ways to those technologies where ethical intervention is effective. So we've got discordance, but discordance is not sufficient. We also need to talk about the features of that technology that affect those features. So we've talked about sort of ontological basis for things, and talked about how technology tends to generate discordance. I now want to go through these features, provide a little bit of content to them, and then compare them with cases from nuclear and biotechnology. Okay, so let's just go back to these features, starting with resource accessibility. That's the materials necessary to get these things to produce unsafe or unjust models are legally and widely available, relatively low cost, and general purpose. So I think we have a misperception about these things because we tend to look at the production of AIs in specific corporate contexts, where you need very large warehouses filled with servers that require a lot of electricity, power, water, etc. That the training and using these things in any meaningful way just isn't accessible to citizens. But I think that's false. For instance, if you want to do some training at home, or you want to use a reasonably powerful model at home, and you want to use it offline for some nefarious reason, then you can just acquire a bunch of cores to do this. I mean, you could repurpose crypto mining cores, for instance. You could buy these for £5,000, which is relatively cheap, and just have them sent to your house, and then get some model and run it offline. Now, you might do some perfectly legitimate things with that, but you also might not. And our point is just that if you wanted to do that, the resources are quite available to you and relatively low cost, and completely legal, because it's just a mobile website. You can just go buy them if you like. What about epistemic shallowness? I'm just trying to provide a little bit more content to each of these things before we do some comparison. So that's just that you don't generally require in-depth knowledge in order to use these things. And I'll provide some example of that. I used to know how to write Python code, but I don't really anymore. I have a kind of shallow knowledge of it. But nonetheless, I can ask a language model to write me a piece of Python code that will scrape Exeter University websites for information about philosophers, and in 2 seconds it gives me this. And I kind of squinted it, and oh yeah, I remember Beautiful Soup from grad school. That's probably going to print the names, emails, and titles of various staff, and if you run it, that's exactly what it does. More than that, you don't even need to have that level of coding knowledge to run this thing. You can just ask it to do that task, and then it'll write its own code, and then it'll also run that code, and that's exactly what it does. It spits out the names, titles, and emails of all the professors of philosophy at Exeter University, lecturers of philosophy at Exeter University, excluding Tom Roberts. I feel like that's a personal slight. It knows what you're doing, Tom. It's decided to leave you off for this. Okay, so it doesn't require much knowledge to use that. Finally, that it's proliferative. The production of one model provides all that's required to disseminate numerous copies of that model. Again, I think we have this misperception that we need very large servers or lots of information to use these things, but it's just not true. So if you go to eleutheriaai.com, you can get a bunch of open source AIs to do a lot of different stuff. For instance, this one, I should have made that bigger, that's GPT-J6V, which is a 6 billion parameter model. It's about as powerful as GPT-3 was, if you ever messed around with that. And you can just download it and use it at your will. I want to point out that this thing was downloaded 242,995 times last month, implying that there are at least 242,000 copies of the model just as powerful as GPT-3 just out there for free engagement. I mean, when we had worries about what people might do with GPT and people started throwing safety restrictions on it, we were under the belief that, yeah, the corporations could control whether or not which safety regulations were on those things, but you can just access this model and run it independently if you want. So now I want to compare these things to nuclear and biotechnology to kind of draw a little bit more depth about what those things are, and also to make the comparative claim that AI sort of sits higher in that space. So in the case of biotechnology and nuclear technology, ethical or practically motivated interventions have been much more successful, and many of the worst predicted outcomes of their development have thus far not been realized. Of course, there have been unsafe and unjust uses of both of these technologies, as with virtually any technology we can imagine. Our point is just that the ethically motivated interventions to prevent some of these uses have overall been more successful. Right, so the first thing I want to argue in talking about both resource accessibility and epistemic shallowness of nuclear technology is that developing nuclear technology is difficult, and part of that difficulty is explained by the rarity of the resources and the depth of knowledge required. Okay. So developing token technologies requires both epistemic and material resources. Building a nuclear reactor requires fuel, nuclear material, coolants, control rods, moderators, containment housing, etc. It also requires knowledge of how to engineer, assemble those materials such that they produce the desired effect. Even if one has acquired the necessary materials for a nuclear reactor, they need to know how to put them together to produce the fission reaction required for generating energy. So it's typically difficult to access both categories of resources for a given technology. And you might think that this is because of effective policies and governance regarding such technologies. For instance, there are numerous international laws and treaties regulating the acquisition and use of nuclear technology. The International Atomic Energy Agency executes inspections across the globe to enforce the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and in the US, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission regulations require restrictions on the uranium-235 enrichment levels in nuclear reactor fuel. So there are good policies. Nuclear regulations have generally been successful in mitigating the unethical use of nuclear technologies and unsafe use of nuclear technologies. Yet it's not policies alone we want to claim that make nuclear regulation effective. The effectiveness of nuclear regulation is bolstered by the difficulty of acquiring the material for constructing a nuclear reactor. Policies are one cause of that difficulty, but there are others. And moreover, there are other causes that would remain even if policy largely aimed to facilitate nuclear technology engineering. For instance, the necessary isotope, uranium-235, is relatively rare in uranium deposits, only about 0.72% of a deposit, according to this agency. Moreover, obtaining materials like boron, cadmium, silver for cooling rods, etc., or the massive quantity of water required for effective coolants and moderators is impractical and extremely costly. Right. So even if we all set our minds to creating a world where nuclear technology was unregulated, it would still be the case that it's difficult to develop these technologies and do unethical or unsafe things with them because uranium is a rare and precious metal. Also, on the side of epistemic shallowness, even if you were to obtain the necessary materials, effective regulation benefits from the difficulty of requiring the physics, chemistry, and engineering knowledge to put that material to use. Uranium has to undergo a complex enrichment process to separate 235 from other isotopes. Cooling rods have to be fabricated, riggings for coolants and moderators have to be constructed, and a containment housing must be built. Furthermore, the construction and operation of a nuclear reactor is subject to the division of epistemic labor. It's not clear that any one individual actually knows how to do this. And no known individual or small, non-governmental and non-corporate group has ever successfully navigated the task, as far as we know. Okay, so this is just to say that on grounds of epistemic shallowness and resource accessibility, developing nuclear technology is quite difficult. And we want to say that's part of the reason why it's not just policy. Now I want to turn to a scary instance of biotechnology. So what I'll argue for in this section is that developing biological weapons is more difficult than it seems, and part of that difficulty is explained by the difficulty of acquiring the resources and knowledge required to produce them, that is, to produce biological weapons. So contrary to what I just said, concentrating on the resource accessibility, one of the reasons that biological weapons are prima facie concerning is the apparent ubiquity of the biological resources required for their production. Many potential biological weapons are produced using parts or products of organisms that are free-living and common microorganisms, and this explains why these organisms are both a natural public health concern and a potential source of materials for intentional harm. So if I asked you, how would you acquire the most deadly human poison known to exist? The answer is that you can usually find it in dirt. So let's talk about that dirt. So consider specifically the toxin botulinum, or BOTN. I'll say this is a product of various species of Clostridium botulinum and the natural cause, botulism poisoning. BOTN is a key target for research and regulation as a potential biological weapons agent for a number of reasons, including the fact that BOTN is the most poisonous substance known. It's lethal at doses that you cannot see, and that botulinum is a common organism. Despite a clear prohibition by the UN Biological Weapons Convention, it's well known that various state actors that I will mention here have produced, stockpiled, and tested weapons, including BOTN. Given the sufficient resources of state actors, the acquisition and manufacture of a purified bioproduct of BOTN from cultured sea botulinum is a possibility, although there don't seem to be many cases it has actually been deployed in biological warfare. So why is this happening? We want to draw attention to the fact that BOTN and similar agents are not commonly used by terrorist groups. If the resource is so common and the product is so deadly, why is it not a common weapon of choice by malicious actors? Well, part of the reason for this is regulatory and principled. There is commercially available BOTN used for cosmetic Botox and the treatment of a bunch of nerve conditions. But the concentration of the toxin in commercially available products is orders of magnitude lower than would be required for a lethal dose. That is, successful regulatory practices aimed at harm reduction have probably prevented at least some unsafe and unjust uses of the toxin. But this generates a type 2 discordance between anyone who might want to use BOTN to cause harm and those in the medical profession who have legitimate uses for it, and forces bad actors to turn to other methods of acquisition. I'm now going to talk about one of those bad actors, and specifically the only known bad actor that's really succeeded, at least even in part, in doing this. So this is a group from Japan, whose name I'll probably mess up, Om Shinrikyo, also known as Om, and since they persist to today, they're known as Aleph. They're a religious group that I can't go into the description of. They're very interesting. You may have heard of them before because they were responsible for the successful sarin gas attacks in Tokyo in 1994, also called the Tokyo sarin gas attacks, so the Matsumoto sarin gas attacks. They also attempted, but failed, at several biological weapons attacks using BOTN. And so our question about them is, why did they fail? And this has started to inspire a small amount of scholarship on why they failed. So Bleak, writing for Nuclear Threat Initiative and reviewing a report by Danzig et al. That I'll come back to later, says of their failure that it had as much to do with its often bungling approach as with inherent challenges of deploying biological weapons. So I think the first thing to point out is that we have a misperception about the nature of biological weapons, that they are so dangerous that even bad science can produce a good weapon. But it seems like that's just not true. Bad science does not produce a good weapon. And part of that is because of inherent challenges of using it, or what I would want to call sort of ontological features of the situation. Okay, so among those inherent challenges are various technical difficulties associated with producing BOTN from input samples containing C-botulinum. Despite having a soil source where this organism is present, analogous to the case of the proportion of isotopes of uranium just discussed, only a very small fraction of the microbial agents in any given sample will be the desired species. It's not known whether a reasonably successful isolation procedure was used, but as Bleak notes, if it was not, then that would provide one clear explanation for the apparent abject failure of Ohm's C-botulinum efforts. Since the soil sample would contain thousands of living bacteria and fungal species, it would crowd out any desired C-botulinum the samples might have contained, as you can see from my totally made up dirt graph. It seems plausible that if there's a lot of dirt, if there's a lot of C-botulinum in the world, we'd be able to get at it. But when we try, we realize that the available organism is a really small fraction of what we might be getting. Okay, so this is a point about resource accessibility that also touches on systemic shallowness. Another feature of toxins produced by microorganisms that works against resource accessibility is that toxins generally need to be produced at a particular quantity. Now, given that BOTN is the most poisonous compound known, this required quantity should be the lowest that it might be for any bioweapon. That's why it's a special case and worthy of consideration. Nonetheless, it appears that group efforts did not produce the required quantity of BOTN, and this is likely attributable to their inability to acquire required resources, proper fermentation and aerosol technology, and knowledge of how to use it. So it's not that you can't acquire reading materials about this. You can just buy books about fermentation technology, Clostridium fermentation, and aerosol, etc. You can acquire all of those things. It's acquiring knowledge from that material and the ability to put it to use with appropriate technologies that's difficult. Okay, so this quote was just so good that I have to read the whole thing. This is from Bleak's Revisiting Shinrikyo, New Insights into the most extensive non-state biological weapons program known to date. Cult members cultivated material in two very large, crude, homemade fermenters. Whether these were capable of maintaining the anaerobic environment or temperatures required is unclear. No efforts were made to purify the resulting yellow liquid, a mixture of growth media and bacteria. Enormous volumes of the yellow liquid were supposedly produced. Mice on which the yellow liquid was tested showed no toxic effects, and one cult member reportedly slipped into a fermentation tank and nearly drowned, but subsequently showed no signs of illness. The cult nonetheless disseminated large volumes of the liquid from trucks fitted with crude spray devices. No one appears to have been affected. So, as another commenter puts it, the own case illustrates how acquiring virulent strains of biological agents can be a major hurdle for prospective bioterrorists. So it's tempting and maybe even reasonably precautious to operate on the assumption that the failure of Ohm was simply a technical failure, one that might be overcome by some future group, and maybe it will. However, Ohm was apparently sophisticated and lavishly funded. They had a lot of education, at least enough to produce a remarkable 450 metric tons of potentially BOTN containing liquid and spray it all over the place. And this speaks against the idea that technical hurdles would be easily overcome. Indeed, that there are technical hurdles that are difficult to overcome in this case, but not in similar cases, is precisely the point. Material and epistemic resource inaccessibility is the likely explanation for the failure of Ohm's terrorist endeavors. So it simply repeatedly failed to use bioweapons, but they succeeded at chemical weapons. Why is that? So this report by Danzig et al. Sort of gives a reason for that, which I think is quite interesting. Ohm's history suggests that with access to the relevant literature, a generally skilled chemist can produce a chemical weapon, whereas a generally trained biologist is likely to have more difficulty propagating and conserving an unfamiliar pathogen. The distinction between explicit book knowledge and tacit or hands-on knowledge may be helpful here. Developing biological weapons appears to require more tacit knowledge, while chemists may be adequately positioned to develop weapons after just consulting relevant documentation. Okay, so that was to show that there are various features of various uses of biotechnology that are easier to intervene on. It's easier to prevent these things from happening, largely because of features of resource inaccessibility and the epistemic depth of those situations. We didn't really address proliferativity in both of these cases, but that's a time constraint. So now what I just want to do is just list some features that I think make AI different from both of the cases we've identified so far. Nuclear and biotechnology require specialized working settings, but AI tools are often general purpose. Nuclear and biotechnology is expensive, but most AI training and use systems are less expensive. Nuclear and biotech equipment is often not legal for public ownership, but most, if not all, AI development tools are legal, and since general purpose, you can't illegalize them. Nuclear and biotech equipment is large, and AI development tools tend to be small, for another reason they're difficult to detect and regulate. Nuclear and biotechnology requires many ancillary resources, but AI tools generally only require electricity. Nuclear and biotech development is physically as well as legally dangerous for those undertaking it, so it requires a variety of unsafe resources. But AI development tools are comparatively safe, and I think we could list others here. So this is just to say that I think ultimately AI sits higher in this space than biotechnology and nuclear technology. I mean, really, we just addressed this part of our table or our space, but I think we can make a roughly similar case of proliferation. So you probably know that I like numbered arguments, so I just want to go back over the argument of the talk so far in more sort of flattened out form. So first, this point that I take us to have argued for, that the following things are inversely related to the difficulty of regulating a technology. That is, the difficulty of requiring resources for it, the depth of knowledge required, and the difficulty of making copies of the technology. AI scores low on all of these, at least by comparison with nuclear and biotechnology, if not in some absolute sense. And we argue for that. And from 1 and 2 follows 3, that AI is difficult to regulate, comparatively at least. 4 to 6 are perhaps points that I said were obvious, but we're arguing for nonetheless. That powerful technologies tend to generate discordance, that AI is powerful, and so it tends to generate discordance. Finally, 7, which we might call Vinge's point, that's about discordance and what leads people to do, is that discordance tends to lead to the production of unjust or unsafe technologies, or unjust or unsafe uses of general purpose technologies. And from 6 and 7, you get 8, that AI tends to lead to the production of unjust or unsafe technologies. And then just the conjunction of 3 and 8 is that AI tends to lead to the production of unjust or unsafe technologies, and it's difficult to regulate. And I'd say that's roughly the claim that AI is futile. Thank you.